Ses kontrol. S. Ses kontrol 1 2 3. Ses. Ses kontrol 1 2 3.
Hello? Oh, we're up.
John, my apologies. I'm just firing up.
Sorry?
My apologies. I'm just firing up the laptop.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Just let me know when. Actually,
Okay, John, sorry.
All right. All right. So welcome back to this afternoon session of the Giganet Symposium. This afternoon we have two interactive sessions. The first one presented by, we have Laura DeNartis here, who's also authoring with Mark Raymond and Van Hamsen on the emergence of contention in global internet governance. We also have Aaron Van Clayton and his co-author who's not here, Carrie Holden, on Internet Governance in the African City. It's been retitled, right? Yes. And then also Derek Cogburn, Uncovering the Conceptual Antecedents of the Net Mundial Outcome Document on the Future of Global Internet Governance. Please, Laura.
Thank you very much, John. Testing the mic out. Can you hear me? This mic, thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everyone. As John mentioned, my name is Laura DeNartis. I'm a professor at American University in Washington, D.C. I want to thank the Giganet Program Committee for making this all happen. It's wonderful to be here again and present a new paper called The Emergence of Contention in Internet Governance. I do want to mention that one of my co-authors is in the audience, Samantha Bradshaw, so if you could just stand up for a second, Samantha, so people can see you, who are responsible for much of the paper, so thanks, just want to introduce you. It does seem like yesterday that we were gathered in Athens for the first meeting of Giganet and IGF. There were a number of controversial and unresolved issues in the air at that time, as you know. But since that time, a lot has happened. We've had the state-induced Egyptian internet outage, WikiLeaks' release of diplomatic cables, security attacks like Stuxnet and GhostNet, conflict over the international telecommunication regulations at the Wicket. I could go on and on and on, and disclosures, of course, about the NSA's surveillance. Now, in combination, this series of controversies has done a lot. It has brought greater visibility to internet governance. It has challenged perceptions of some that coordination of the internet is just a technical issue. And it has created some loss of trust in the systems that run the internet. Now, the functions that keep the internet operational, while never without tension, now reflect both real and perceived conflicts. So this paper addresses the following questions. Has internet governance actually become more contentious? Those of us who have been following this for a while are aware of the issues, but is it more contentious now? If so, how can this be explained? What are the deeper problems of representation and distribution that can contribute to contention? And then finally, what are prospects for global cooperation within this context? Let me just start by saying that internet policy contention absolutely did not begin with Snowden, and neither did media coverage of internet governance start with Snowden. This is just a quick chart that shows comparative media coverage and associated contention spikes looking at a number of different terms related to internet governance. So there's really a long history of contention over internet governance. But what our paper does is it starts by suggesting a framework of 5 indicators that suggest rising contention. Now, the first has to be, of course, escalation of conflicts associated with ICANN and the IANA functions. These issues both predate concern over surveillance, and I always like to emphasize that they have no direct relationship with surveillance. Concerns date back at least to WSIS, but in the wake of these surveillance revelations, new voices have questioned the stewardship of the US in this area. A second indicator involves state actors pushing for alternative arrangements in interconnection. Now, especially, we developed this case in detail in the paper, but especially around the Wicket and World Conference on International Telecommunications, which was marked by concern about greater governmental control of content and some sweeping questions about economic and political power on the internet. A third indicator involves a number of technical infrastructure tensions, such as the depletion of the IPv4 address space, broadband governance conflicts around the world, net neutrality questions, and what I describe as a resurgence of proprietary protocols and business models based on that. A fourth indicator is the increasing, and this is an important point, the increasing co-opting of infrastructures of internet governance for political and economic objectives that have nothing to do with the core functions of these systems. There's a shift from governance of infrastructure to governance by infrastructure. Right now, there's the open lawsuit in the US over seeking control of the Iranian country code top-level domain. The expansion of TLDs in general has served as a proxy for tensions between territorially bound interests and global companies whose interests cross borders, absolutely. We also see and heard today a little bit about the use of the DNS for copyright enforcement. The bottom line is that internet governance infrastructures are now a proxy for broader geopolitical and socioeconomic tension. And perhaps the most obvious indicator of contention in internet governance is the state erosion of the original normative basis of the internet, whether we're talking about the expanding Great Firewall of China or expansive surveillance practices by the United States government. What's causing this rising contention? In short, internet governance is shifting from a set of coordination problems to a set of cooperation problems. The first, the coordination problems, can usually be thought of and understood as technical. In many areas of global governance, such as civil aviation or postal systems, there are international institutions rooted in epistemic communities that are primarily made up of subject matter experts. And historically, internet governance has been one of these issue areas. Authoritative decisions were made by networks and small groups dominated by technologists, often with little state involvement. In contrast, in coordination problems, or in coordination games, if you will, actors receive the most benefit by working together. So let me just rephrase that because I stumbled over a little jet lag. In coordination problems, actors receive the most individual benefit if they work together with other actors. For example, a common language, common protocols, a common system of DNS. So it doesn't matter what system is used, but what matters is that all actors use the same system. We're now instead in a set of cooperation problems. There are both perceived and real conflicts of interest. So in these cooperation games, the most individual benefit can be produced by defecting while others cooperate, even though the most collective benefit is produced when everyone works together. So essentially, actors can have an incentive to not cooperate while others do so. Now, the coordination nature of internet governance is complicated by all of those tensions that I already mentioned. And what we set out to do in this paper is to use theories from international relations to help explain this internet governance shift. I'll just mention each of these really briefly. One explanation is that an exogenous shock can occur that disrupts a system. One such shock was the Snowden revelations about the extent of NSA surveillance. This explanation from IR theory can be called the sunspot theory of internet governance regime transition. Institutional arrangements, regimes, and markets often settle into a condition of stable equilibrium, but events can transpire that have sufficient force to knock that system out of place and misalign it. Another possibility from IR theory has to do simply with changing market conditions and the reality that the internet has grown into a technology upon which every sector of the economy and our very social systems depend. So much more is at stake. A third theory that can be applied is called hegemonic transition theory, in which the changes to the internet governance regime can have roots in the declining relative power of the US in this area. The US has obviously loomed very large in the history of internet governance. The internet was born originally in the US. The US IT sector has dominated. The US has had unique oversight over ICANN. But the growing relative capacity of other states have created conflict over how scarce internet resources are distributed and over the norms that govern the internet. And again, that explanation comes from hegemonic transition theory. Now, related to this is an explanation that has to do with what's called normative contestation. And this explains why all we ever talk about at some of these gatherings is principles and norms. These normative differences can be substantive, about the nature of the rules, or they can also be procedural, about the means for reaching decisions. In this case, internet governance tension can be explained by the presence of divergent values or in the absence of mutually agreed upon procedures for resolving differences. And then finally, there's a theory related to endogenous institutional change. And the idea behind that is that the original institutional arrangement itself generated the seeds of its own change. And I won't get into the details of that right now. So where does that leave us? What I wanted to do is end with some normative questions that we raise in our paper. Based on government proposals in response to contention, the first question has to be, are we likely to see various forms of internet fragmentation? And I know there's a lot of empirical work being done on this issue right now, and so it's really to be determined. But we're already heading there, with policies placing restrictions on where data is stored, so data localization policies. We're seeing extensive systems of filtering and blocking, and we now have content blocking efforts such as the right to be forgotten. So there are always values in tension with these different kinds of measures, whether it's internet universality versus nation-specific internets, whether, and also situations in which, as I would say it, one person's privacy is another person's censorship. Another question is, to what extent will contention destabilize the internet governance ecosystem? It's very easy to take for granted the system that keeps the internet operational, but they're technically and institutionally quite complex, as this crowd knows. Now, to the extent that legacy systems are no longer seen as sufficient or even legitimate, there will be increasing calls to alter them or to create replacements. One other issue I want to raise is the question, given that states usually dominate in international relations with cooperation problems, this could raise troubling questions about whether the private sector-led multi-stakeholder model can survive in this context. So what are the prospects for meaningful cooperation? I do want to point to one thing, and it's that policy negotiations have to stop viewing internet governance as a monolithic thing, as a single system. That in order to have effective cooperation, there has to be a more nuanced deconstruction of the layers of internet governance. And there's a steep learning curve here. And this chart will get me in trouble like it did last year. But I broke it down into two instead of one. And it's just a reminder that the internet governance is not a single system, that it can be broken down into really 144 different characteristics. And just borrowing this slide from last year in Bali, that there has to be a greater deconstruction of this in order to have realistic internet governance debates. Now, looking at other cooperation problems, what can we learn from other areas? Like the early nuclear era, it took states roughly 20 years to create confidence-building measures and other relevant institutions. So we're in this generational challenge because rising contention will have implications for internet stability, freedom, and internet governance power structure. So that's what our working paper is about, drawing from international relations theory, and thank you very much for listening.
I think I was engrossed in Professor DeNardis's talk that I forgot to get myself organized. I'm Dr. Aaron Van Clayton from the University of Greenwich, and I would like to share the research that I have completed with my research colleague, Dr. Holden, who couldn't make it today because she's on an NSF-funded project in Canada, and they have some meetings this week, unfortunately. So the title is changed. It was a very short title, a working title, let's call it, in the guide, but it's exploring the tensions and incongruities of internet governance in Africa. And the story of ICTs in Africa is about achieving sustainable economic growth and societal progress through the development and application of digital technologies. And while we've seen a lot of progress in some areas, there are other areas on the continent that's still playing catch up. These deficits are encapsulated in the concept of the digital divide, and this separates the connected North from the disconnected South. And there are some authors shown there who articulate this point very clearly. In our research, rather than entering the debate on the digital divide as having material existence, we are interested in understanding its rhetorical influence, especially in how African nation states are represented and participate in international internet governance. So our aim is to illuminate the functionality of the digital divide discourse in framing problems prone to Africa and in forging interventionist strategies as solutions. The study provided critical commentary on the way African states are seen and accounted for at the international level, and the effects of this on the national level. It also looked at the way that they interact and relate to the operating discourses of international governance and the inherent tensions African states experience that are co-produced through technological advancement and global political orders. So what did we do? We set out to understand the current state of internet governance in these 7 African countries. The countries were chosen based on their political and cultural histories. Sierra Leone and Liberia, for example, are post-conflict countries. As such, they've struggled to ignite their economies in the shadow of civil war. The international community has been particularly active there in providing humanitarian assistance in the period following the war, and more recently, there have been a lot of investments in technological development. Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda are different parts of Africa, of course, but they all consider their ICT sectors advanced in comparison to other African countries. They host educational training and industrial startups. And these countries reflect on their progress as an example of best practice to other African states. Zimbabwe in Southern Africa represents Southern Africa, but its recent political history has put it at odds with international policy processes. So it was interesting to see how their experience compares with the other countries in the study in engaging with the international internet community. Finally, Ethiopia is in East Africa and has not only had a unique history for African independence in that it was never colonized, and I think that has implications for how they approach certain issues, but also has one of the lowest internet penetration rates in sub-Saharan Africa. So they are in the early stages of their pathology toward ICT provision. There are 2 strands of data collection. There's primary data, which was collected in the form of in-depth interviews with ministers, deputy ministers, and senior government officials of ICT in these 7 countries. And then this was triangulated with statistical analysis of 50 policy documents and reports taken from the international bodies of internet governance, the Pan-African bodies, and then the nation states themselves. We wanted to see the extent to which there was variability and how certain themes and concepts were positioned or prioritized across the 3 groups. In the study, we developed 3 analytical framing devices that provide insight into the data and its relevance to answering or understanding larger questions about ICTs in Africa. Evaluative value is the importance of being counted and measured, and then universalism versus localism is defined there as seeing the local through the lens of universalizing principles. And the last one is the rural-urban divide, which classifies both as being on the same developmental tract. So as we get through the data, we will unpack these a bit more to understand, what there is to understand about them. Of course, you're probably familiar with the multi-stakeholder model, obviously, of internet governance, but this also serves as an interesting starting point for our participation, for our participating countries. One of the conditions of participation as a stakeholder was representation of the state within this model. And each of the African nation states we studied had in recent years consolidated their ICT services under a single ministerial banner and established a corresponding national regulatory body. Now, up until that point, individual agencies oversaw various aspects of telecommunications, postal and courier services, and what have you. But the process of centralization was initiated for 2 main reasons. First, hosting a central ministry was seen as an effective way to optimize their role, the role of ICTs across government services, and it helped to roll out a platform of ICT provision in society. Secondly, centralization had afforded these countries a stakeholder role at the international level. In other words, the presence of an identifiable ministry and minister increases visibility of the country in international fora, but it also enhances interoperability. The participant here articulates an evaluative process in which Ghana has leapt up 15 points in the UN e-government league table. As the participant illustrates, in order to compete globally, there is an imperative for African countries to establish their place in the ranking order and realize their worth in relation to others. As you read here, he starts by stating how he feels ICT has improved in the country, but then goes on to validate this through the cold, hard figures of the UN survey. So that survey and other surveys, they serve as an example of what we would refer to as evaluative value. Drawing on the work of scholars such as Scott in 1999 and Michael Power also in the same year, evaluative value can be understood as an accounting practice that generates comparative data, and by virtue of this, promises greater visibility, representation, and ultimately legitimacy in multi-stakeholder fora. Indeed, the measurable state is a prerequisite of having stakeholder status. Using Power's influential argument on the rise of the audit society, we argue that the ability to measure ICT activities in both the public and private spheres means that the state itself becomes a measurable object. In this way, the possibilities of governments to count ICT-related activities is in effect a means to accumulate a type of value that permits entry into regional and international arenas and to be taken seriously once within them. It also means that fundamental changes have taken shape at the state level to render it measurable, and that includes things like transparency and impact measures. Accumulating evaluative value, then, is not a benign or objective process. Instead, it conditions what it sets out to measure. As we can see, the international community sought to reestablish or reaffirm the internet as a domain free from rules of states and monopolies of corporations. By implication, African nation states are compelled to respond to international political discourse that operates within the political administrative logic of the West and is underpinned by a set of liberal and universalizing principles. However, there are tensions and inequalities that condition the modes of participation and interaction with the international community. And what we have seen in this research is the production of a type of localism in response to these imbalances. And this is at the heart of our second framing device. It concerns relations between the universalizing discourses of international fora and the conceptualization of local need. We demonstrate how Internet governance is predicated on universalizing principles of need and access that recapitulate development discourse. As such, we show how local communities and needs are conceptualized through the lens of universalizing norms and ideas concerning what the Internet is and what it should do in society. However, statistical analysis conducted for this study shows that the transition from the international to the national is not a seamless process. Using content analysis software, the three sets of data were analyzed for word frequency. So that is the international data produced by ICON and WSIS and so on, and the Pan-African regional set, and then the nation state, which includes the ICT policy. Now from this, I took the shared themes and concepts and ranked them before running a Spearman's ranking coefficient on SPSS. And this is the output that you saw here. What it showed was that the country, and the mic is off, yeah, the country and the Pan-African level data were more positively correlated to each other. That means that the rankings or the positionality of these shared terms were quite similar. That was a 0.724. Then the country level and the international level was much farther apart, so that was 0.615. However, the Pan-African and the global groups tended to have a much stronger correlation, which was at 0.838. So the big story is the gap between the nation state and the international level. And this further raises a question as to the extent to which interpretation and implementation of international directives at the national level are occurring or are as seamless as they should be. And it also raises a question about the communication between the nation states and the international level. Our data revealed that the form of governance proposed through the multi-stakeholder model poses problems for African nation states. Participants pointed out that they are experiencing difficulties in attending the meetings, achieving fair representation, and being heard at the international level. In addition, global inequities have seen much of the funding and expertise channeled into ICTs fly out of the country and back to the West through highly paid consultants and other contracting relationships. Is this the problem, the mic?
Yes.
What about this? Okay. Okay. It works better, okay. Developing critical mass and local content has become configured as a matter of national pride in facing such challenges for these countries. And in the following slides, though, I will concentrate on the issue of representation in order to illustrate how localism comes to be defined through the lens of international discourse. Both of the participants on the slide, their quotes, use the term drowned out, quote unquote, to describe their lack of representation at the international level. African nation states may have stakeholder status, but their voice is not necessarily being heard. And this can be understood as a human resource issue, which is alluded to in the second quote, where the participant comments on richer countries being able to send armies of professionals to international meetings. And he made a connection between the size of delegation parties and the volume of the national voice. From this perspective, Internet governance emerges as territorial in the sense that the more representatives a country sends, the greater their stake in discussions and ultimately decision-making. In the face of demonstrable problems, the participants spoke about the government's response being sort of rallying a national spirit and agenda. The moral position that the Ethiopian respondent on the slide mentions refers to the responsibility of the country to serve national interests and needs, presumably above and beyond the international set. It is the monopolistic power that he argues is the only way to serve this purpose at the moment. In the slide, it shows that Ethiopia is the only country in Africa, really, that keeps a monopoly over their telecommunications industry, defying international, let's say, encouragement to liberalize the market. So by implication, Ethiopia's national interests and needs would be eclipsed by deregulation of its telecommunications market. Thus, the Ethiopian government's monopoly of this industry can be seen as a way to resist the international community's attempts to impose regulation on the local. However, the story of Ethiopia and their monopoly is quite unique in the countries that we interviewed. In other countries, participants referred to the development of local content as an answer to the universalizing force of international internet governance. The generation of local content becomes an important step in building a new imagined community of online nationhood. In the quotation mentioned, shown on the slide, the Sierra Leonean participant outlines the country's local content policy. Actually, they were the only country to have one of the 7 countries we studied. It was a 60% locally developed content and 40% non-local. Local content is considered by participants to be synergistic with social and economic development, and in particular, improvements in literacy levels, educational attainment, and political participation, which in turn strengthen the capacities of social institutions such as the universities. Local needs and interests operate much like a discourse enacted to stake out and reassert national interest. In this way, national identity is seen as synonymous with cultural difference that needs protecting from the globalizing trends of the internet. However, what this implies is state control over access to all content and the reinstatement of particularly national norms of behavior and practice. In this scenario, internet use becomes an outlet for good, responsible citizenry. However, from the perspective of the international community, control of this kind could be seen as an attempt to, quote, recreate the kind of control they once had over traditional territorial media, as cited by Mueller in 2013. While multi-stakeholder status has good intentions for implementing universal principles that avoid monopolistic behavior and cultural dominance, African nation-states continue to experience problems. These range from the resources and will to participate to the iniquities of global capital sucking money and expertise out of the country. This results in these countries fulfilling a vexed position in their participation at the international level. One response to this vexation is to rally support for national identity and autonomy. In other words, to assert one's power and influence in a context where these qualities are increasingly undermined. And the result of this is that localism, that is, an understanding of local needs and cultures, is reconfigured as representative of nationhood. This dialectic between the international and the national level enables a particular vision of African societies, and as we argue in the next set of slides, it overlooks the historical and cultural specificity of relations between technology and society. Our final framing device builds on the previous two and focuses on spatial difference, and in particular the distinction in ICT policy between the urban and the rural. We found that African nation-states deployed a blanket policy in which the distinction between urban and rural is made, but only in order to treat them as the same. The urban and the rural context are conceived as being on the same pathway to development, with the urban being slightly further along. This framing device highlights a tendency to impose verisimilitude, that is, the appearance of being true or real, on radically different geographical, political, and cultural domains. While the problem of the state and its stakeholder role continues to vex African governments, we notice that an understanding of what constitutes spatial and cultural difference was absent from both sets of data, that is, the interview data as well as the policy documents. By this, we mean that while the rural and urban areas are defined as distinct, they are placed on the same scale of development. Our concern is how to account for the material conditions that produce the urban-rural divide, which, particularly in ICT, which means that they do not and may not ever exist on the same scales, and perhaps maybe they shouldn't. This lack of distinction is an effect of centralized policy processes required to achieve stakeholder status. In other words, states cannot appear to house discord, disunity, and incongruity that would jeopardize the harmonization of a unified policy discourse. So in conclusion, we developed 3 analytical framing devices that unraveled some of the tensions and incongruities African nation states experience in their interactions with the international level. And then what our analysis reveals is that the relationship between the national and international levels creates a particular vision of ICTs in African societies. However, there are blind spots in this discussion that require deeper and more nuanced interpretations. So the next stages would be to proceed with study using more ethnographic and discourse analysis aimed at providing material semiotic understandings of the internet in action in Africa. Thank you. Oh, penises. Oh, I guess it doesn't. He may need it. It might be. It's possible.
Testing? Testing? Okay, good. So thank you very much. You have to hold it here? I'm not good at that. Thank you very much. My name is Derek Cogburn. I am very happy to be here and to see everyone. I'm also a professor at American University, as is Laura. And I have slightly changed the title of my paper, at least the part, there's a colon now. So uncovering the conceptual antecedents of the Net Mundial outcome document, colon, a computational text analysis. So just a small change. And I wanted to do that because I see this paper as trying to make 2 contributions. One is a contribution on the substance, to talk a little bit about those various influences on this document that has become a relatively important milestone for us in thinking about multi-stakeholder participation in internet governance, but also a contribution to some of the methodological issues and some opportunities that I see for people who want to start to analyze some of these large-scale text-based archives that are available in this area. I also want to thank John and the program committee for letting me experiment a little bit with some of these techniques. I know it's a little bit different for Giganet, and so I'm happy to be able to explore a little bit and share with you what we found. And so thank you for taking that risk, John. Nonetheless, I do have a caveat that this is work in progress. It's still very early, and some of the findings are still a little squishy. So I would encourage you not to quote or cite from this work until we have time to further refine it. So in terms of a roadmap, what I'd like to do is first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the problem both from an internet governance perspective and from a methodological perspective. It's coming, I think. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the conceptual framework that, and we got one of them. Well, I'll wait for you guys. So I'll talk a little bit about the conceptual framework that I use. We'll talk about some of the specific research questions that I ask in the paper, and there are 4. And then I'll go through a little bit of the methodology, which is a little bit different than many people may be used to, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll talk about the findings in relation to each of those research questions. Have a little bit of a discussion and conclusion, and say a little bit about the future research. So that's the way I'd like to structure the next 15 minutes or so. So in terms of the problem, I'd like to take us back to Net Mundial and this very important meeting that was designed as a one-off contribution to restructuring how we think about internet governance, particularly after the Snowden revelations. So most of us know that quite a few of the background processes that led to the Net Mundial meeting included Brazilian President Rousseff's response to the Snowden revelations, her charge that it was a breach of international law, and encouraging offering her country as a host of this an initiative that could respond to aggregating different comments and perspectives about what the future of internet governance might look like. We also had the Montevideo statement, the various groups that were being organized, OneNet, CGI.br, and with Brazil agreeing to host the Net Mundial conference, they put together a fairly elaborate structure for facilitating the transparency and the openness of that particular conference. So included in that were the Executive Multi-Stakeholder Committee and the High-Level Multi-Stakeholder Committee. All of these designed to, there we are, at least we got one of them. All right, great. Thank you. So all of these designed to facilitate discussions around the world about what the future of internet governance should look like, and really trying to facilitate that conversation in a very structured way. So the committee put together this multi-stakeholder contribution system that was able to take in text inputs from different stakeholders around the world, and they requested inputs in two areas, the internet governance principles and the roadmap for the future evolution of the internet governance ecosystem. So the idea is that from different communities around the world, different stakeholders, comments and contributions were coming into this contribution system to reflect these two areas. Coming out of that was the non-binding outcome document. So that's what was produced by all of these contributions, and the contribution document went through these various committees. It went through the EMC and through the High-Level Multi-Stakeholder Committee, and then those of you who were in Sao Paulo know that the final negotiations took place in person, face-to-face, with different contributions coming into play there. So it's a very interesting outcome document. It's a different document than the WSIS Declaration of Principles. It's a different document from most other types of similar documents that are the result of, usually smaller negotiations, backroom negotiations, and so forth. So this was a very transparent process. Up until the very, very, very last minute, there was a lot of transparency to this process. So for that reason, I thought that it was an interesting example to explore, because of all these textual inputs, which of the texts had greater influence and impact on the outcome document. So I thought, just as an exercise, again, both in the substance and in the process, that it might be useful to try to attempt this. Also, the Net Mundial document has had a fairly impactful life of its own. It has contributed to the Net Mundial initiative that the World Economic Forum has just sponsored, and it also has influenced the Istanbul IGF preparation, as you would expect these documents to do, to continue to serve as reference points. Most of the presentations today have talked about referencing the WSIS documents and so forth. So these documents have a life of their own. And then lastly, it's also important for me to provide some thoughts and ideas about how we might cope with these very large amounts of textual data that are becoming available to us. For those of us who have been, studying these kinds of processes going back to WSIS or beyond or before, you know that there are overwhelming amounts of data that are produced. Participant lists, participant policy suggestions and recommendations, blog posts, white papers. So there's just tremendous amount of textual data that becomes available to us. Most of us as social scientists are not trained, however, to handle large-scale textual databases. So we tend to read maybe a sample of the data that's available, or we just sort of don't recognize that all of this data could make a contribution to our work, and so that was also part of the goal. So if you look at the outcome document, it has a preamble. It has two main areas. It talks about the Internet governance principles, and some of the key areas that it focuses on are human rights and shared values, protection of intermediaries, and so forth. And then the roadmap talks about several process-oriented issues. And so again, the problem that we're trying to look at is what contributions influence the outcome document, and in what ways? So how do we plan to do this? So what we did was we look at this unstructured text, and so again, many analysts talk about unstructured text being one of the largest sources of data available to us in the world. And again, it's something that I think that we don't pay enough attention to trying to analyze this large-scale text. And computational text analysis can help us deal with this large-scale text and to start taking greater advantage of the text. So again, as I said earlier, if we look at the Net Mundial document, you look at this contribution system and the fact that these different contributions were supposed to be going into creating the final document, there's an assumption that one can make that it's likely that some documents, some submissions had greater influence than others in terms of what the final structure of the document looked like. So to start using some of these tools, we have to start to borrow from information science and natural language processing and so forth in terms of some of the techniques that we use. Now, many of us who are political scientists would do better when we collaborate with information scientists and rather than taking all of this on ourselves, but it actually is manageable if you use some of the tools that have not as high a learning curve as trying to write some of your own algorithms or develop some of your own programs. So what happens is you are taking this large corpus, and with most of these techniques, the size of the corpus doesn't matter. So as long as you can store the corpus on your computer, or if you have access to a high-performance computer, you can have larger and larger corpus of this text. So you use this generalized vector space model where all of the words in the text become available for algorithms for natural language processing. These approaches make an assumption that is frequently referred to as the bag of words assumption. The bag of words assumption basically means that it's the words themselves that matter, not necessarily the order or the structure of the words. And this is a pretty big assumption, but a lot of work in text mining and natural language processing has shown that even though there are, as I think Giganet was saying this morning, that there are other ways of getting at some of the same question, same thing here. There are other ways to do content analysis and analyze the text, but this bag of words assumption has been pretty powerful at explaining large text-based data sets. After you start to prepare the data in that way, then you develop the model and you start to look at how you can extract meaning from this unstructured text. And there are a variety of ways to do that we'll talk about in a moment. So some of the advantages, this is a powerful data reduction technique. Again, you can have extremely large data sets that allow you to make some sense out of what's happening. This is a systematic, replicable technique. So you can imagine if you're trying to read the text themselves, there's a high likelihood of you missing things or skipping over certain elements. So this is very, very systematic and it's replicable. So the same approach that one scholar uses with these techniques, you can take the same code and replicate it on this data set, or even take the library or the dictionaries and apply it to other data sets. It's relatively inexpensive. The software itself, I talk about two different types of software, the commercial tools that we use and the open source tools. The commercial tools are sometimes expensive, but it's less expensive than actually going to the meetings per se. So if you look at most of the IGFs over the last couple of years, there are transcripts provided from every workshop. Verbatim transcripts. So that becomes tremendously valuable data. So it's relatively inexpensive and also unobtrusive as well. And it allows you to deal with current events as well as past events as well. So you can go back and look across multiple previous events. So, 4 research questions that we looked at. What were the dominant themes found across all stakeholder submissions? What concepts and themes were similar and different between various stakeholder communities? What concepts and themes were similar and different between regions? And what submissions were most influential in determining the final text of the Net Mundial outcome document? Again, there are other ways of doing this, and those of us who were in the room, we understand the negotiations back and forth, particularly at the last minute. But the point here is just to say, what do the textual documents say about the influences on the final outcome document? So this is an overview of the various methodologies that I use to answer those 4 questions. I use something called the modified CRISP-DM, which is the cross-industry standard for data mining, sort of converted for text mining. So there are several steps that one goes through, starting with determining the purpose of the study, looking for what kind of data is available, starting to prepare and clean the data, developing models, evaluating the results, and then deploying the results. Now, I like to try to see how much I can get out of a data set with no human intervention. But for some of the more interesting questions, there is some human intervention that is required. And so I did do some coding to be able to get at the second and third research questions. So I coded just by stakeholder and by region. And this was part of it. This was a bit of a challenge for me because there are a variety of ways one could have coded these submissions. So for stakeholder, you'll see what I have coded here: government, international organization, private sector, civil society, and so forth. And then the same thing with region. Again, highly imperfect, but I did it partially because I wanted to explore a couple of other things as I went through the process. So we can critique that and talk about it later. So just in terms of the demographics of the submissions, the largest submissions by far came from government and also came from civil society. So there was a heavy set of responses coming in from civil society, government, followed by the private sector. Fewer from academia and the technical community, and fewer from international organizations as well. In terms of regions, Western Europe was the highest in terms of submissions, followed by the US, quite a few submissions from Latin America, and then this first bar here is multiple regions, and I coded that looking at organizations that seem to be based in multiple places and not just one or another. So if we look at the dominant themes, and this is the simplest way to start to approach this. It's far from perfect, but it does give you a sense of, out of a corpus that had about 180 documents in it, what are the dominant themes. So you look at the theme that jumps out at you the most, which is right at the top, is human rights. So if you think about, you could take this corpus and actually know nothing about it and be able to say that the dominant theme coming out of this corpus was human rights. This is completely without human intervention. Now, those of us who read the documents and participated in the meetings know that, in fact, human rights was one of the dominant themes. It became one of the dominant themes in the document itself, and now is one of the dominant themes of IGF. Civil society, the information society, root zone, freedom of expression, digital economy, the private sector, internet freedom, intellectual property, the IANA functions, the Internet Governance Forum, multi-stakeholder model, free flow, and then personal data. So again, just think about somebody who approached this corpus. Now, we happen to know a lot about, what those submissions were about.
I was just wondering how you
Yes, these are key, what are called key phrases.
Human rights would also have fundamental rights, freedom of expression, privacy, all of that?
No, not in this. This is a very simple, straightforward, which is just looking at phrases that are defined as I think I defined it as 2 to 5 word phrases. So what you're talking about would be the next step, where you could start to build dictionaries, which would aggregate 4 or 5 or however many concepts would actually reflect that concept, and then you would do it again to reflect that as opposed to the actual text itself. Yep. But again, the point here, but that requires human intervention. So what I wanted to show was how much you can get out of it with no human intervention. And it's still, pretty accurate, pretty interesting in terms of what it's able to show. So looking at the stakeholder analysis, and I'm right at my end of time here. This is a way of showing what are the dominant themes by sector. So if you look at the organizational groups across the top and the different terms across the bottom, you can start to compare what issues are important to which stakeholder groupings. Another interesting way of looking at this is a similarity index to see, some of you may be surprised by this, to see which stakeholder groupings were more similar to the other. So the closer to one you are on the left-hand side, the more similar your submissions. So the most similar submissions came from government and private sector. The next similar set of submissions came from civil society and international organizations. And then there was a similarity between the private sector, those two clusters, and then the rest start to get less and less similar. So, it would be very interesting to explore this further, but this is what the raw data show, are these similarities between, again, government, private sector, civil society, and international organizations. This is another way of looking at it. This is a multidimensional scaling where you take all of the text and you plot it along these axes, and then you look at, in this case, a crosstab with organizational type. So you can start to see where there are clusters of organizations related to certain types of terms. So here you can see civil society in the organizational type that I listed as multi-stakeholder, clustering together, international organizations kind of off by itself, and then several others down here. In terms of regional analysis, you find that the most similar regional contributions came from Western Europe and what I'm coding as multiple, and then the similarities between Western Europe and the US. And I'm going to just hold on the questions if I can. I'm over time here. And then there's just a couple other ways to do this. So the last part that I wanted to show here was if you look at all the submissions and trying to predict which submissions were most influential in the final outcome document. And so what I did was I developed a classification model based on all of the submissions by organization type. And I wanted to see which organization type best predicted the outcome document. This is a technique that's being used for spam filtering and so forth, so where you can try to predict, is this a spam email or not. So nobody can see. Oh, it's over here. Thank you. I'm too behind. Thank you, Laura. So it's a little bit hard to see, but what this shows is that the final document most looks like the governmental submissions. The governmental submissions best predicted the final content of the final document. So just in closing, there was obviously strong participation from governments and civil society in US and Western Europe. Government and private sector aligned more closely. Human rights and internet governance, one of the key themes in the submissions. And interestingly, surveillance didn't show up as a key word. And even when I went in specifically to search for surveillance, it wasn't as much in the documents as I thought it was. So it was only 15 times in all the documents, 5 in civil society, 3 in government, 2 in academia, and the rest in other. So in terms of final conclusions, I think these techniques continue to be valuable. They're not meant to replace a subject matter expert who's going to do a close reading of the text, but I think these are complementary approaches. I'm a mixed methodologist myself, so there are a whole range of ways to get at this, but this is one, I think, very valuable way of dealing with large amounts of text. And I put here that the better the quality of data, the faster you can automate these processes. So for example, if the submissions had been structured in a certain way, it would have been easier to get more correlations out of the text rather than having to go in and manually code some of these things. Okay, so there is some future research, but I'll leave that for questions. So thank you.
All right, so we'll take questions from the floor now. We have an extended period for discussions. This is an interaction or interactional session. So questions from the floor.
There was a person that had questions, but I couldn't answer.
Oh, there in the back.
I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just ask one right now. When you speak about the predictive method that you used at the final, for the final findings for the influence, did you just look at the frequency of the words? Was it purely automated, or was there another method that you used to predict the outcome document? And when you found that the governmental documents had the best predictions?
So that's a great question. So what I did was develop what's called a classification model. And so the classification model gets built in a number of different ways. I use something called a naive Bayes classifier, and I won't go into all the details about how it works, but it allows you to look at which documents are available and what are the characteristics of those documents. And then the model is looking at the new document to say, if you look at the characteristics of the new document, which of these source documents does it most closely match? So it's able to figure out what parts of the source documents are unique and are better triggers for being able to predict that document, and then you take that model and apply it to either one document or a whole source of new documents. It's an algorithm. You can tweak it, you can make changes, and you can decide different characteristics of it, but it's an automated process.
Hi, my name's Ted Pallas. I'm from Canada, Simon Fraser University. I wanted to go back to Professor Van Clayton. Sorry, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And just with respect to Africa, partially because I'm involved in a project with one of our graduate students, and Ethiopia is actually one of the places we're focusing in on. And of the different places that you talked about, Ethiopia really sticks out for a number of different reasons. One you mentioned in terms of the monopoly over all of the digital communications. The other is with respect to the Human Rights Watch came out with a report about Ethiopia this past spring, where they talk about the monolithic surveillance structure that's going on within Ethiopia. And I was curious if you could just comment a little bit in terms of what role you think that plays in, because that's not something that you mentioned in terms of something that distinguishes the different countries that you looked at, and I wonder if you could comment on that dimension for those countries that you focused in on.
Which are you referring to, the surveillance or the...
Particularly the surveillance, yeah.
Yeah, I think there was never an explicit mention of surveying the populations. However, there was other terms or language used. For example, in Kenya, when we talked about what is it called? Monitoring, censorship on the internet. They said, well, no, we don't censor, but then we sensitize our users on how to use it. So it's a very strange kind of way of programming. I don't know how that's achieved, maybe through public service messages and this kind of thing on responsible internet usage. All of the countries proclaim to have a very open internet without censorship, except Ethiopia, actually. So, but in terms of an explicit mention of it, there wasn't this about surveying the populations.
So actually, can I just do a follow-up on that? Because one of the things that characterized the analysis was that the people that you were interviewing were all government people, and I wonder if you felt that expanding it out to the other side, the users, would be beneficial.
Yes, well, that would be a lot of interviewing. Yeah, we just focused on the people who were responsible for implementing ICT policy, because our main concern was to look at this relationship between the nation state and the kind of the international internet governance. But I think in sort of developing the project a bit more, we would want to look at in the first step sort of civil societies that are occurring. With that, you cannot really do, unless you have like a lot of funding, you cannot do that for 7 countries. So the countries that have been taken forward for the next stages of the project, which are already in the works, is Ghana and in West Africa, and Uganda and Kenya in East Africa, and that's based on well, a number of factors. But Sierra Leone and Liberia would have been the countries to take forward. Unfortunately, we decided to hold off until the Ebola virus gets sorted out for obvious reasons. But I think you can do that, but you have to do that kind of at a structured one country sort of deeper analysis rather than this broader look. And I think it has to start with civil society organizations, because I think they might have a handle on the pulse of the people in a different way that the government does, as an easy start.
Other questions? Oh, I see 2 on this row. Start there. Pass the
Sure. I'll fall asleep if I do. So, a question for Derek. You had indicated in the first part of your talk that you were trying to determine the impact the different actors had on the final statement, and I didn't, in your results section, I didn't get any of that. It was more of a who made the most comments, but there wasn't a relating of the comments to the actual final document. Were you able to do anything of that, or get some insight into that?
I think that was when you fell asleep. No, it was right at the end when I was rushing to finish up.
It's good.
This is good too? Oh, okay. So it was right at the end, right as I was rushing to finish up. And it's the algorithm that the woman here was asking me about. So it's a classifier that looks at all the contributions and then which contribution best predicts the outcome document. And it was the government submissions that were identified as the highest contributor to the document itself, followed by the private sector, I must say. And then third was civil society. In fact, just 1 second. Third was civil society, and then I believe it was, I know that the academic contributions were smaller, much, much smaller. But government, private sector, civil society in that order in terms of the influence on the final document.
I would like to address a question to Laura. In the second part of your presentation, a very interesting presentation, you mentioned, if I have taken correct notes, the problem of normative contestation as one of the contentions of internet governance. if I quote your own definition from your most recent Internet governance book, then you say Internet governance involves the design and administration of the technologies necessary to keep the Internet operational and facilitate the enactment of substantive policies around these technologies. So Internet governance is mainly procedural, operational, maybe technological. And I had said probably we never really had normative consensus on important substantive topics. Therefore, I would like to hear a little bit more about your concerns regarding normative contestations.
Thank you very much. I truly appreciate the quote out of my recent book that came out in January of this year, The Global War for Internet Governance. And it's a good question, and I would say that if you look at that definition of Internet governance as the administration of the technologies necessary to keep the Internet operational and the enactment of substantive policy around that, then you could look at either side of that equation and say that there are normative considerations in both. So one of my other books is called Protocol Politics. So even in one of the most technical areas of Internet governance, there are still normative decisions that can come into play. The question is whether those originate in the private sector, whether they originate with the state or civil society. There are normative considerations that enter it, and then how much more so on the other side of that, the policy questions. It's more obvious there where there are values in conflict. Just looking at something like the right to be forgotten in Europe, on one hand, there's the value of privacy. On the other hand, there's the value of free speech, and sometimes those come into contention with each other. But thank you very much for the question.
Other questions? Go back.
I only do this because there weren't others, but and this one is for Professor Cogburn. It was interesting hearing about your work. It's we're doing some similar things, and so hearing you trying to deal with the same kind of problems we're dealing with is fascinating. In our case, the place we're starting is with the Snowden revelations and some of the commentaries that were done in the Guardian, for example, after the series of articles, and if you look at the comments that arise from that, there's something like 35,000 comments. I'm a multi-method researcher like you, been focusing more on the qualitative end recently, but to me that was something that was great to look at, and the kind of program that you're talking about is the one that we're using at SFU is called Inspire, and I was curious, and it does similar things, right? There's algorithms that look at, I think of it as kind of a qualitative content analysis, or a cluster analysis, and part of it is to try and take those 35,000 commentaries and to look at, what are some of the core themes, and to use that as a way to then look at the individual comments, to help sample as a way of sampling down. And anyway, but I was curious if you could perhaps comment a little bit more about the software that you use and maybe some of the alternatives that you might have had or looked at.
Sure, thank you very much for the question, and it's related to the question that our colleague asked earlier as well. So I'd like to learn about Inspire as well. I'd like to add it to my list of software, so I don't know about that one. Because there are packages that make it very easy to capture social media data, to capture the comments related to Facebook posts and YouTube posts and so forth. So one of them is the QSR in vivo software that has something called InCapture, which is really good at capturing the comments on a social media post or something like that. The problem with the Cactus tools, I mean, they're great, and they're better than most of us have had for most of our careers, but they are very labor intensive. So when you deal with 35,000 posts, it can download them very easily for you, but then with the Cactus tools, there's a lot that you still have to do on your own. So the what I talked about in the paper is that there are two approaches that I recommend people take. So there are commercial tools, or maybe three if you think about it that way. So there are commercial tools that you can download to your own computer and use. And the one that I like the best is the Provalis Research Suite out of Canada. It's probably the best mixed methods research suite available. Its big limitation is that it's Windows only, and that it's relatively pricey. It's about, I think, $500 for a license to be able to use it. And they do have a fully functional 30-day trial version. It's got three components. It's got WordStat, SimStat, and QDA Miner. QDA Miner is a CACDAS tool. CACDAS stands for Computer Assisted Qualitative Data Analysis Software, and that's the one where you do most of the coding and so forth. And then you have WordStat, which is the text miner, and then there's a statistical package that's added onto it. There are a couple of commercial packages that you can, services that you can buy on the web. So there's something called Text Sifter. Another one is called Deduce. Those are interesting and pretty good as well. And then on the open source side is R. And all of this was presented with the commercial package, but I really like to use R the best. So R is a programming language. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's used very heavily in statistical analysis, but it has a number of add-on packages. So it has a text mining package that plugs into R that makes it very, very powerful. And then R is also parallelized, so it will work on a high-performance distributed computing environment, so you can have really, really large data sets and be able to use RTM. Now, in terms of the two questions, I'm going to just kind of allude to a question that you had earlier. So the simple word frequency type analysis is a good place to start, and it's where I started here, but it's not where I would recommend ending up. But it is valuable, so it would give you, you could start and immediately, and we can work on it over coffee if you want, you'd be able to tell, you have a good sense of what the dominant themes were in the 35,000 words almost instantly. And we could tweak it a little bit and get closer and closer to a better sense. But that's still not ideal. To take it another step, at least within my limitations, is to start building dictionaries. And so you can build dictionaries that are around concepts and clusters. So you can have the software help you build the dictionary, though. So you can do it yourself. So you can take a very deductive approach and say, these are the concepts that I want to look for in the text. And you can build a dictionary around that, or it's called a categorization model, and then have it show you the degree to which that dictionary is reflected in the text. So that's one way to do it. Or you can build it from within the text. So you can do hierarchical clustering, and you can start to, and I was going to show some of that, but I decided not to. You can start to see, it's almost like a, what do you call that technique? Factor analysis. So it'll show you basically what the factors are and which words are clustering together, and then you have to figure out what do those clusters represent. So, and there are a couple of other ways that the software can help you build the dictionaries within the software. That's also what people are doing when they're doing sentiment analysis. So if you want to say positive and negative sentiment, you can build a dictionary to see if the comments were positive, and I can give you that dictionary. So you can see if are the comments mostly positive or mostly negative, and that's building a dictionary of which words and phrases would be used if they were positive and which ones were negative. The nice thing about that too is that we can share those dictionaries. So you can start, if we developed a very comprehensive dictionary for internet governance, we could share that and then use it on different data sets.
I still have a question for Professor Janarnis, which I hesitated to ask because I don't want to put you on the spot. So if you don't want to answer, take it offline, that's fine. But I was just wondering, based on your paper, the emergence of contention and your experience and your research, what your hopes and or expectations are for the IGF and for the steps beyond. The IGF what? The steps beyond. It's, was that me? I'm sorry. I love being put on the spot.
I mean, it's been my position all along that the IGF is not internet governance. It's a discussion about internet governance. And there's so much analysis done on the IGF, which is very valuable. But if you look at that, you think civil society is involved in internet governance. I would just ask the question, where is civil society involved in the actual practice of internet governance as it occurs? So one hope that I would have is that if the IGF can connect in, if it does end up connecting in with internet governance at all, maybe there would be more hope for the involvement of civil society. But it's, your question is basically about the IGF and beyond. Right. I suspect that what will happen is that it will continue to be a non-binding event that's very useful because it gets people together talking. It has an agenda-setting function, and it helps to frame what the issues are, and it provides for voices to become involved. But I think that there's a real danger to that also, because it gives the world the impression that we actually have multi-stakeholder internet governance, and people actually analyze how multi-stakeholder is the IGF, when in fact we're not very multi-stakeholder at all. We have certain functions of internet governance that are just done by the private sector, certain that are done by the state, and very little that where civil society is involved. So I think the best hope would be to continue the discussion, but for it to be put in perspective, so that either people outside of the IGF don't think that this is actually internet governance that needs to stop, or else that it eventually has some kind of hook into the actual practice of IG as it unfolds. That's the jet-lagged answer.
Other questions from the floor? Okay, there being no questions on the floor, let's thank our panelists one last time. Oh, I lost, there we go. So we are reconvening now at 3:30, if memory serves. 3:30, so you have a bit longer of a break this afternoon than you did this morning. And we'll be back for the final interaction session of the day. So see you at 3:30.